Good morning. Welcome to the special meeting of the BET Budget Committee meeting. And we're here today to consider requests for budget adjustments for the Board of Education. And so we have today with us our Budget Committee members, Leslie Moriarty, Laura Erickson and Nisha Arora, as well as Peter Minarski and Erlen Geiger, our controller and budget director, respectively. We're here to consider two requests from the Board of Education, ED 8, which is an additional appropriation for Central Middle School repairs in a total of $940,000. And we have with us Kathleen Stowe on the conference line, the chairman of the Board of Education. We have Superintendent of Schools, Tony Jones, with us to discuss this, as well as the Chief Operating Officer, Sean O'Keefe, and Dan Watson, responsible for schools facilities. So would you like to explain for us additional appropriation of the Central Middle School repairs?
Good morning again, everybody.
Different meeting.
Okay, so the first thing I'll do is take you through the first chart in the package, which is a summary of the emergency costs that were incurred for the scaffolding and transportation and so on during that emergency period. So we had scaffolding and bridging installed by Werner. There was an original installation of about $264,000. Subsequently, additional bridging was needed on several walls that added $142,000. Lighting was installed for this at $206,000, and is estimated to be about $40,000 of overtime relative to getting all this work done in time for the students to return on February 22nd. And then finally, there was some gravel installed for safety reasons, adding about $10,000. So the total bridging work, related work, $662,000. Other related costs, DTC, who came up with they're the structural engineers, they'll be preparing the bid package and running the bid process, estimated at about $50,000. And we also have $5,000 allocated for project management fees with our vendor CSG. So in total, $717,000. We are covering the vast majority of this with existing masonry capital funding for central and district-wide of $671. So not contained in this request, not contained in this expenses, $46,141, and that will be part of the appropriation request on the next page. So on the next page, we've got our estimate of the repairs, $860,058, trade and labor costs for $607,000, charge for $30,000 for general conditions, overhead and profit, insurance $75,000, contingency of $121, and $27,000 for architectural and engineering and other consulting as necessary. So in total, $860,058. I mentioned earlier that there were emergency costs not contained with the available masonry capital, so we've added it here, $46,141. There was also $27,000 of additional transportation for the week of February 7th through 11th to transport students from Central Middle School to the three schools that were cooperating with us, and then an estimated $6,000 for police overtime for traffic and so on. So in total, it comes to about $940,000. That's the interim request relative to the repairs. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Now, as I understand, these interim repairs are to really bridge the school for the next 5 years. Is that correct?
It is a 5-year solution, yes.
Thank you. And in talking with it will be pertinent when we go for the approval, with our budget director, these are considered maintenance repairs and will be funded out of the general fund as a way of funding it. So, do we have any questions about this that we'd like to ask anyone on the BOE team?
I just want to clarify that this is, when we say 5-year repair, the repair is being done this summer to keep the facility open for up to 5 years, not that the repair will be going on for 5 years,
That's correct.
right?
Yeah, I think Mr. Watson explained in an earlier session that he expects the repairs will be completed in about 6 weeks once the school year ends. Is that correct, Mr. Watson?
That is correct.
And will this start immediately after the school year ends? Or?
God willing and the river don't rise, yes.
Thank you, Dan. So do we have any questions on this? Leslie?
I just want to talk, to understand the use of funds and that we're using operating capital appropriately and the effect on the rest of your capital appropriation. So as reflected on this sheet, the emergency repairs, or the work that was done, they're not repairs, the emergency costs over the past 2 weeks, you have charged those to a capital account or they're charged to an operating account? So
To a capital account,
To a capital account.
a masonry capital account.
All right, so I guess there are 2 questions. One, is that an appropriate use of those funds since this is scaffolding? And can that be applied to masonry? But if I looked at your masonry appropriation, and I sent you what I had dug up about the open appropriations you have for masonry and the projects that you had identified would be applicable for the use of those funds, so that the 671,000 exceeds the amount you had in open appropriations for central masonry projects. Is that,
There was
You agree with that?
436,000 of central available and another, I believe it's 235 in district-wide.
all right, so talking to the central numbers, there wouldn't be other funds that I guess the new appropriation for masonry for central in the fiscal '23 would put sufficient funds towards that school at your disposal that future masonry work would be covered. So that's a question, right? So in the fiscal '23 budget, you're going to have another 420,000 approximately of masonry funding. And whatever masonry work was anticipated the past 2 years that hasn't been done, that was sitting there, you're using for a different purpose. So I just want to make sure you've got enough money in your masonry budget for central going forward.
Dan?
Yeah, anything that we've identified as an issue, we should be able to cover with the money requested. If
So then
something
the-
else comes up, we'll be right back here.
The follow-up question, though, is if there were
71.
471 for central projects and you're using 671, there's 200,000 of projects you anticipated using or needing for other schools that you're now redeploying to use for this interim need, this emergency cost need. And I want to make sure or understand that those 200,000 of projects anticipated at other schools are not, that either they're projects that you completed for a lower cost, or is the scope not needed, or are those funds you're going to be requesting in future years?
I think it's a combination of all three. There's items that we've identified and completed, and there's funding available. There's items that we put a dollar amount to that maybe it's in excess of what we need. There's some items that we can put off. For instance, maybe we're going to replace a sidewalk for aesthetics or something to that effect, that we feel we can put that off. And that could be at any school. But we looked long and hard at it, and I think we're in good shape, dollar-wise.
I mean, I think what you were trying to do is to reduce the dollar you're requesting now, and I understand that motivation to be conservative with your funds and your request. But if there are scopes of work which were anticipated that still need to be completed, I wouldn't want you using those funds in a different manner to request later. I would rather have you ask for what you need for this emergency. And so that's what I can't discern. The information we have is at a very high level. And you can tell me that you thought through those issues and that you're comfortable using the amount you have in the masonry budget. But I felt we needed to understand your
We
explanation.
did have that discussion, and as Dan has stated, we're comfortable with what remains for masonry work, district-wide and central.
So now I want to turn the question to our budget director on the appropriate allocation of these funds, whether it be operating or capital.
Well,
Or you,
our guidelines for a depreciable asset are at least 5 years, and that's for equipment. It should be much longer for an improvement like this. And since this won't even exist in 3 years, this is just a maintenance item. That's all it is.
So I think Leslie's raised an interesting question. So they're using capital money already, so is it better to extinguish the capital funds and put this into operating? Is that the question you're asking, Leslie?
I mean, if
On the
this,
current
Yeah.
repairs that have been done on the emergency to date? Is that what you're asking?
to be honest, what I heard Roland just say is that even the 5-year repairs, you would not do as capital, you would do as operating funds. So really, the request would be 1,610,199 of an interim appropriation for operating. And along with that, we could ask the Board of Education to close out the 670,000 of capital appropriations so that both the BET and the RTM know that the net difference in cash is really 940,000. But from an accounting standpoint, I'm hearing our budget director say it really should all be operating.
Is that what you're saying, Roland, that perhaps we need to rethink on how this sheet was prepared and, look at this slightly differently and as
It's operating, and if we don't take the hit now when it's spent, if the building is demolished, we'll take the hit then.
So,
We don't have an asset that we can depreciate over 20, 30 years.
so I think what we're saying here, Sean, I don't think we need to, is perhaps this number, as Leslie has pointed out, needs to be increased by the money spent to date. And then,
Plus the emergency,
I'm sorry?
plus the summer repairs.
Plus, for both, well, the summer repairs now are, as Roland has presented them, are operating and they come out of the general fund. But I think what you're suggesting, and now I think Roland is agreeing, that the emergency funding that we've done to date, or that has been done to date, has been done out of capital accounts, and instead, we should add that to this number, the 940,000, and then, with the concurrence of the BOE, reduce the capital accounts that were being used by, as you said, close out those accounts by that same amount that will be moving into operating. Is that what
Right.
you're saying?
That is correct.
And Roland, but I think what's critical here is that Roland agree and that Sean agree with this presentation also. Yes, Roland, you're nodding your head.
Let me make a comment on this. If you look at the previous CIP sheet it's $2.971 million for masonry work that would need to be done.
Right.
And per Roland's logic, is that shouldn't be capital at all either, since the building would be demolished.
Saying in
So,
the fiscal '23 budget request.
Exactly.
so do we know that those,
Yeah.
yeah, but when we heard from Dan before, we're not sure whether that money will be used as such. I mean, quite frankly, it's hard to put into operating what we don't know what we're going to spend, so maybe it's better to leave that where it is and come back and reconsider this if, Dan finds a use for it and so forth. Otherwise, I think we're making our accounting to anticipate things that may or may not happen, getting much too complex here. But I do understand. So Roland, what are our new numbers here? And first Laura wants to ask a question.
Well, I have two comments. One, I don't want to get into a long accounting decision. I'll let the accountants figure it out. But at the end of the day, I think I look at the North Miami, we've been here before with other situations. I look at North Miamis, I look at Coscob floods, and I think we might have some discretion in how we handle these funds, because certainly before, we didn't put the transportation in the operating line. So I think we sort of need to look at what has been our practice and what makes sense, and not get bogged down in some of this. So if we have any discretion, I'm wondering if we should adhere to what we've done in the past, which is treat these as capital items.
But we've never been to the point where we're expecting to demolish either of those buildings. So the examples, Coscob is, there and planning to be there for, a long period of time. And likewise, North Miami School, yes, there were
Well,
emergencies.
again, so I'll leave it to the accountants, and I'm happy to make those adjustments. I just don't know if it's the best use of our time to figure that all out right now, but if we have to do that,
Well,
so
we're
be
going
it.
to
This
have
is
to
the
do it
first-
in order to
Okay, this
approve
is
the
first I've-
appropriation.
This is the first I've heard of it. So the second question I
Well,
have,
the question was raised by Leslie, but I think it's a good question to ask Roland, and it was constructive in this discussion.
yeah, I have no problem with it, but I just, again, it's a wrinkle. My next question is really, in discussions with the risk manager, have you confirmed this is not an event, it is available for a claim?
I have.
Okay, thank you.
So Roland, can we just come back to the numbers and so forth and what you're recommending? Because I'm going to take Roland's advice, since he and Pete, obviously, since they're the people who are responsible for our books.
Okay, I didn't know when I spoke about this being operating with Sean, I didn't know that it was additional amounts that were spent. I thought it was just all parked or spent against a capital account, that we would take that spending and then move it to operating. I didn't know that there was multiple pieces to this.
So what
But
do you
Leslie-
recommend?
Leslie is, I would agree with what Leslie said.
So what numbers then are you going to give us here? Because we're going to have to amend this.
We just need to increase the 940 by the 671,000.
By what?
The 671,000 that they indicate on their sheets that they allocated to capital.
So,
And also on that, just if we're going to clean up the numbers on the CIP, in that same CIP sheet where we're, the masonry, for 25, 26, we see, I know that's 3 years out, but it's part of the 5-year planning. If we're going to clean it up, there's 591 in there for CMS, which I don't think should be in there either. Right, so the 31 is obviously duped for Old Greenwich in the 23, and then 591 is in for Central for 26.
where are you now?
It's a different issue.
Two different issues, but if we're going to clean up the accounting, so one is we're going to move the 1.6 million from
budget sheet.
capital to operating, right?
Okay, so we're doing interims at the moment, interim approval.
Yeah, I know, but I'm looking at are we cleaning up the capital numbers for
Not in this
masonry or no?
meeting.
We're just
Okay,
doing
good.
an approval
That's fine.
here. And then I think, as Leslie said, then we're going to have to, the BOE will work with Roland, give us the information so that $671,000 is extinguished from the capital accounts, because we're going to move these to operating, correct? You understand that, John?
I understand.
And so you will work with Roland to clean
Yes,
this up and
easy
clean
to
up
do.
our sheets? Okay, and okay, thank you. So do we have more questions on ED 8?
Yes.
Laura?
So are we planning to allocate these costs to individual line items on the operating line, transportation to the appropriate transportation line? other expenses to to 149? I mean, do we have to break it down, or how detailed does our motion need to be?
Well, I
For
think
today's
the
purpose.
application does call various, it just says various lines.
Okay, so you guys are going to figure that out. So the motion that you're looking for, which I assume Leslie's going to make, is an interim appropriation of 940 plus 671. Jeff gave me the number earlier, but I didn't write it down.
1,611,000. So I'll make that motion now, which is to approve an additional appropriation request for the Board of Education and various accounts for 1,611,000.
Should we amend that motion to make it two-part, that the 671 should be closed out of existing capital?
I don't think we need to amend it yet. Maybe she can just add to it because there's no second yet. But Leslie, will you add that the,
And the Budget Committee expects the Board of Ed to close out 671,000 of masonry capital project.
so is that,
I'll second.
and so Leslie has moved and Laura has seconded that, Leslie's motion. Are we ready to take a vote? Any more discussion on this motion?
Can I say something real fast, or can I not be lawyer?
Of course you can say. Kathleen Stowe?
Okay. Sorry, and I know it's not great when I'm not in the room there, so again, I apologize for this situation. But this will technically put us over budget on operating for this year, correct? I'm just trying to follow this conversation, and I guess I want that noted, and this is obviously changing the resolution or bringing the RTM as well.
Your budget increases by the
Right.
amount of this appropriation, so it's
Right.
a wash.
Okay, fine. All right, so it will change the resolution that we're now putting forward to the RTM.
Yes, that it will change the resolution.
Okay, so we'll have to just note that. And I mean, we've already submitted it, but we did say it was subject to DEC approval, so now that's fine. We'll have to amend that, Sean, just as an FYI. Okay,
Got it.
I would add in the explanos that you're closing out 671,000, so it's really an interim request of the 940.
Can you hear, I think Leslie was talking to Sean, but I wasn't sure if you could hear that, Kathleen?
I did, thank you.
Okay. Okay, so are we ready to take a vote now? Okay, so those in favor of Leslie's motion, seconded by Laura? Leslie?
Yes.
Nisha?
Yes.
Laura?
Yes.
And Leslie Tarkington's a yes also, so that vote is 4-0-0. So now we're going to take up ED9, request by the Board of Education for an additional appropriation for Central Middle School education specifications and environmental analysis. And again, that's for $150,000. So who would like to explain this one?
I would.
Okay, so Sean will
So
explain.
there's no supporting backup there, other than this is $150,000 to create an ed specs for Central Middle School, as well as conduct some environmental testing at that site. So, and I think Nisha mentioned the split of it, estimated split, 15,000 roughly for the ed specs and 135 for environmental testing.
Thank you. Is there any more comment on this from?
I will say after the Budget Committee, we did not want to split it out, though, where it's exactly 15. The Board of Ed felt like just in case we needed a little bit more, that we were not committed to just 15,000 for the ed spec, just in case. Because we are on such an accelerated timeline.
Thank you. Laura?
I just had a question about the environmental testing. Is this somebody you have in-house, or do you have to go to bid for this?
I'm going to assume we have to go to bid, although we have done testing before. But let me just say, it's not just environmental. We're looking at, we discussed before, we've spoken before about water issues. We have to make sure that the soil has the structural capacity to put a building on top of it. And that would help us decide what type of building we're going to put there, whether it's raised on pilings or whatever. So it's
So
more
it's sort
than
of a
just.
geotechnical analysis as well, right?
Yes,
Because we've tested there before, have we not, when we had the discussion about fields?
partially. That's correct.
But my guess is not tested for the weight bearing and so forth, because fields are very different than putting a, very large 110,000 square feet or their amount. I mean, the weight bearing issues will be critical to understand in this particular situation.
No, go ahead.
Just on the environmental testing, it's anticipated, it's like the typical Phase 1 testing that's done on most building construction sites. It's not, I know that we're very sensitive here, especially in some of our sites, to look for the really nasty contaminants, but this is just the general, not the general, but this is just the Phase 1 type of testing that a building committee would do anyway later on in the process. Is that correct?
I want to ask, I'm going to ask the question, though. I thought that our process required Phase 1 and Phase 2 environmental testing, Leslie.
Which is often done in phasing. I don't know if it requires the Phase 2 test.
I mean, I look back to the, what was required on New Lebanon. I thought both Phase 1 and Phase 2 environmental testing. I know, do you have any comment on this, Dan?
I don't have any comment on it, but I'll look into it for you, for sure.
Thank you. So is that satisfactory, Leslie? You'll look into it? Okay. Nisha?
Yep, so, I lost my train of thought, I'm sorry. So the, for the 135 that we're allocating for, it looks like there might be a little bit of, like a feasibility, part of what would, maybe normally would have been in feasibility to test if that, the space in the back is actually even somewhere where we would want to put the building. And for those that were listening in on the first part, I do think that that's a decision that the building committee will have to consider again. So to the extent that some of the work you do now can be leveraged later on, whenever that building committee is put in place somewhere in the next few months, I'd encourage whatever, whether it's, I heard you say at the Board of Ed meeting, we might poke some holes and try and figure out what's going on back there, but to the extent that we don't have to duplicate whatever is done now later on, I would encourage a lot of transparency on what is actually done, so we don't duplicate. And then secondly, on the, I would like all hands on deck to be on, if we can get this grant application in by June 30th, if it looks like that is a possible way we might need to go, or if that's something that we could explore. And to the extent that we need some assistance filling out that grant to make sure we get it done, whether it's extra resources or consultants, maybe some of these resources could also be allocated there, which is why I'm comfortable, summing it up, because you might need more money for ed specs, you might need a little bit more, capital, so gives you that movement, so you don't have to come back to us, while you're putting this together, but also think about if you need extra resources to see if we do need to accelerate this and we need some extra, men on deck or women on deck to help us get this through, to also think about, you can use that. And again, not that I'm against environmental testing, but I do think that if we're gonna build this building quickly, efficiently, I think there's a good chance we're going to build it in the same envelope, so we might not need to do some of what we're proposing.
So I think we have to be careful about talking about this alternative, though, because it will mean that the approvals by the BET will come very shortly, as well as approvals by the RTM. And to implement something and go through the processes will be a challenge, let's just put it this way. Leslie?
I just wanted to raise one other point on the educational specifications, because they're being, the administration is being charged with developing those. I just want to, and I know that I heard you talk about the thorough process you intend to go forward, but that clearly it incorporates your enrollment forecasts for that school, standards by educational groups on what middle schools should and shouldn't have. I know that the KDNG did a lot of work on that, and they have numbers of rooms and sizes of rooms laid out, but I think it should be verified. and stakeholder input to develop a process that you do get input as to and it's not just the school building, it's how it's used by the community. If I go back to the Hamilton Avenue School, that community room was part of it as a result of the communication with the community and what that might need, that particular area, what they were missing. We know that this area, the fields here are used by Parks and Rec and the tennis courts, et cetera, to talk about also the exterior needs, traffic patterns, whatever else you can incorporate. Some of those details do come out of architectural and engineering, so I don't want to add that to your plate now. But the process should be as inclusive as it can be, even though we're talking about an accelerated timeframe. And I'm all for trying to accelerate this if we can get comfortable with a process to get it into this year's grant. I don't know what you think the timing could be to develop ed specs, and that's one variable. The second variable with a very different approach that this town's taken before in approving construction funding so early in the process. So I don't know how feasible that really is, but it should be open for discussion. But can I just ask a little bit on expectations on timeframes that you think you need to do, a thorough job on the ed specs?
I feel okay with the ed specs and compressing at the beginning. I worried a lot as I was working to put this timeline together about the Greenwich process. So, I mean, we've already had quite a bit of discussion with the board, obviously today with BET, just on changing the ed spec piece. So if you were talking about, from a timing perspective, trying to get this entire application in by June of '22, it's already March this week. I can't even begin to imagine how we would move this process along that quickly. And, just to generate everything that we would need, because the BET and RTM, ultimately BOE, would all have to say, you're just gonna take a plug number for this building. And I would say, then it's definitely gonna go up, because this number is based on, again, just a square footage estimate. We don't have a design, we don't have any of that. So could we do it? We could, but it's a very different process for Greenwich. And I certainly, after being here my third year, don't see Greenwich as a blank check sort of approach. So I think it would be difficult. Just getting the ed specs alone, I mean, we have to do that, but, in our budget process this year, we didn't have actually that 10-year good projection that we would normally have, because the state is 2 years behind on birth rate data. So I'm hoping that within the next month or two, they're actually going to get caught up as we're coming out. But when we looked, last we looked was probably about a month and a half ago. They still were not caught up with birth rate data, which impacts our enrollment projections. But obviously, everybody in the state would be dealing with that. So I'm sure, they would acknowledge that at the construction office. But it's a challenge. And we did talk about that, actually, when this timeline was put together. Could we make the June 22 deadline? But it would be very, very, very difficult.
It would be a plug
Can I
number.
add a few something here?
Kathleen, yes, so sorry.
Thank you. I think this was a great conversation, and one we very much had on Thursday night. I think, Nisha, Leslie, all of you, Laura and Leslie, you're all asking the questions that we were asking, which is, you look at this and you say 5 years, wow, that's us accelerating it. And it's a little disappointing initially, I'll admit it. I joked that I have a fourth grader now who would be going to Central, and she would be seeing this at best in January of her 8th grade year. So we do want to accelerate it, but then I started to look at the timeline and understand the state process. And I think even Michael Joseph mentioned you also have an opportunity to build sort of a once in a lifetime or once in a generation, perhaps. I mean, we do keep our buildings for over 100 years, so I don't want to, it's a balance. I don't want to rush it so much that we don't get that community input that you're talking about, Leslie Moriarty, and you're right. We need to be really engaging everyone, and it's a balance between moving this as quickly as possible, but then also making sure everyone feels like they've had a voice and that we incorporate things appropriately. And I did too ask about the state process, because I wanted to understand if the reimbursement rate is as low as 10%, and it had extended it a year, but Dr. Jones addressed my question on that. then we have to think about that. Are we saving, $6 million for a year? Is that what we're looking at? But then I believe the answer was, it's not a year, perhaps it's a few months. I don't think we want to just not get reimbursement. So I know that we want to be very careful about making sure we have an opportunity to get money from the state. But there is a lot of work to be done on our own here. And so believe me, if we could get this done a year or so earlier, all hands on deck, let's do it. But at the same time, I recognize that we need to sort of have, to meet everyone's needs in the community. And that starts with the ed spec, right? And that, for example, we can't even go for, we'd be starting it tomorrow if we could, right? But we need to make sure that you guys approve it, this funding, and then the RTM approves it, and then we'll start the process. So I think we know that everyone has the same goal here, and obviously there's going to be an ongoing conversation, and I'm hopeful that we can move it even more quickly, but I'm not sure that's the reality.
Yeah, I want to.
I'm sorry?
I just want to add a couple comments to this. I think one of the assumptions that the timeline makes is that the design is necessary for the grant application. That's how it was talked about at the Board of Ed meeting as well. I didn't see any questions being raised around, could we apply this year with just the ed specs? That your timeline does absolutely have in it, which is what I heard at the Board of Ed meeting as well, that the ed specs would be completed by June of this year. So that is, and again, the reason I am bringing this up is the grant application is in some sense separate from the actual community input and design and all that. You can continue to work on that while the grant application is being reviewed. The only input that the state requires, and again, there are certain assumptions which we discussed, but since we're already capped at a dollar amount per square foot and per student, we already know we're not going to get reimbursed at the 70 million mark. That's just not, that the state doesn't allow it. We can of course build to that, but knowing the constraints that already exist because they're defined by the state process, and the point I'm making is I hear you on, it's difficult to do, it's already March, I hear it. If you need more resources now to have an individual that their only job between March and June is to work on this grant and do whatever they need to get the process in place, that's something that, you should consider. And, again, if I'm sitting in your position, rather than doing, and again, environmental testing and some of the other testing that I think we can hold off on, not because I think it's not required, I just think we might be duplicating efforts, or some things maybe are better served by the building committee. All hands on deck should be now, can we get this grant in? And I understand that there's a state and there's two boards that are involved in getting this done, which is, again, a process that this town has not explored, and I have not even discussed with my own board. But the reason I'm bringing it up is sometimes it's not always, well, that's how we've always done it, that's how we're going to do it. We haven't built a new school in this town. I know New Lab is a little different of a project because it was done in a different grant application process because of racial equity, but we haven't done this in a while in terms of looking at it. And there's always new voices and new ways to do things. So we should absolutely consider it. And what the community really wants is this to be done faster. I didn't hear anybody at the board really have this discussion of, can we accelerate the grant process? And one of the biggest assumptions that is made is that the design needs to be completed, which I don't believe it needs to be. It doesn't even need to be started. So again, I'm not going to spend too much time more on this because I think I've made my point. And if it doesn't get done, it doesn't get done. But I think it's fair and important to look at it to see if we can at least go back to our community and say, we tried, we couldn't do it, we just got stuck with the town, that's what it was. And again, there's also a second point that I made is, if this building is structurally unsound, we should go to the state and make that case, right? Because that is something that, in which case you do not have to follow any timeline of June 30th or December or February. You can really apply any time you feel you're ready to go. But again, that also involves having a communication with the state, someone who knows the process. And if you need more resources on that, that's, something that, we could explore for sure.
Can I respond to that? Actually, just.
Yes, of
Yeah.
course, Tony.
Just a couple of notes, and when I say that the design process is necessary, that's because we're trying to get a real number. So you're correct. If the BET and RTM or the community as a whole is willing to just say, let's throw out 100 million, and then if it comes in at 50 or 60 or 70, that's a really safe way to approach it. But that's not a process I don't think that the town has utilized in the past. And, I've been involved in construction my entire career, and I've had a Board of Ed say, plug in 100 million to build a new school. And that's what the community did, but then they came back and refined the number, but it was a different process than we have in Connecticut. Connecticut's process has these strict timelines because of the reimbursement. So, I mean, it's doable. So when I say the design is there, that's to try to bring a good number, because when we use our square foot number on lots of our projects, we get a lot of questions, why there's not a more refined number, and you can't really get that refined number till you go out to bid. So it's a risk. It's, if the town wants to take that risk,
No, but Tony, what I'm saying is, so I hear you on that. First of all, 100 million is the wrong number, but let's say 40 million, let's say, is the maximum the state is willing to reimburse based on the 365 and the dollar per the dollar per student, right? So we can, even if it goes over, it goes over, right? But you can't, you might, the applicable dollar number that's available for grant is capped at like 40 million, right? So we can say 60, 70, they're only going to look at that 40. So I would be more comfortable putting a low number in, which, again, we can agree or disagree on how it's calculated, but you can just take their number, which is the maximum allowable, right? And multiply by 110, whichever you've been using, and that's fine. Again, just to accelerate the process of getting the grant, because you're not going to get more than that anyways, because it's not allowable. Right, you see what I'm saying? So
I think anybody that's gone through the grant process knows just the back and forth we get on what's reimbursable and what's not. It's one reason it takes years. And right now, with the construction office at the state being in a little bit in flux, that makes me a little nervous too, on just process and timing and all of that.
So, I've only been involved in an amendment, and I remember how complex that was and how long that took. I think we went into the second year. Is that not correct, Leslie? But you don't have to answer that right now. But I want to come back to, some basics on this. I want to ask Roland a question. Again, Roland, if we did split this into ed specs and into environmental, would we need two different approvals, or could we just put it in two different accounts without doing that? This is now capital, so, we've done that when we split out, say, HVAC or whatever into multiple accounts. Can you just give us some advice there?
I mean, we could certainly do it two sub-accounts or something like that, but as you heard Tony say, that, maybe 15,000 is going to end up being 18,000. So that's why they combined it and didn't want to split it out
So,
that precisely.
so I was just thinking maybe we could do some other number, like 20 and 130 or something like that, So
Can I ask what's-
no, I'm asking Roland a question. I just want to understand the process first, Leslie. Then you can always ask questions. Roland?
If you do it like we've done some of these sub-accounts,
Right?
when they're finished with one, they can move money to the other one.
So they could move, okay. That's,
It still becomes a fungible amount.
But we can do it, we can approve it as a 150 and do sub-accounts, and that's possible. And then they do have the opportunity to move it later on. Okay, that's great. So before we get to Leslie, unless it's very specific to this point,
I just want to clarify what you're recommending. Are you
ask the
requesting-
question.
But I don't know if you're pursuing having two different project numbers.
Well, Roland has said we can have sub-accounts, and then if they overspend one, they can move it to the other.
So
This
it's
is,
one project number with.
right,
with
sub-accounts.
Two
That was my
scopes.
question.
Okay.
That was my question. And Roland said it's possible, and they could move it. So, but I also had a couple other questions here that I wanted to ask. Tony, it's my understanding from listening to, your other meeting, that you intend to name a, whatever we want to call it, ed specs committee or something. In this process, will you be looking at this committee to go, say, beyond, Board of Education people or whatever? Would you look at it, especially now, since we're also including in this request for approval, the other, engineering type of studies, locations and so forth? Would you consider including people that, with input, not obviously from me, but that what might be considered for the building committee, because remember, we're accelerating this timeline, and I don't know who those people might be, a person from the BET, which is always, I don't approve this person, but, is typical of it's required of a building committee. A person, one or two people that, maybe people are agreed on to be good people for the building committee that might be engineers or architects or at this point, or construction, to give that kind of input, particularly as we go into this sort of engineering study. I mean, are you receptive to that kind of approach? Or, you and your team, Kathleen, I'm not sure who, makes these decisions.
From the EdSpec perspective, it's really involving, everybody from your PE teachers to your music teachers to making sure the consultant is going out and meeting with as many people as they can to get input, on the building and what's important. From the testing that would happen, I'm going to send that Dan's way in that he's the one that actually would be working to determine what we need done. And I don't know if that incorporates working with the consultants that helps do that, but if you could weigh in, Dan.
We'd have to check all the boxes to make sure. I've been in part of building committees, I've been ad hoc building committees, and I think we discussed it at length the other night, is getting the building committee established quickly is gonna help
Right.
the schedule, and having the right people on the building committee is gonna help the schedule.
Absolutely critical here in this particular project, especially as it's accelerated. But this is going to be a very large, a huge project for the town, for the Board of Education. So, I mean, that's what I was trying to see if, since everything is being accelerated and then we have, Nisha's remarks here, whether there's an opportunity to at least, I mean, when you go back to, we're now not considering the feasibility stage, which has always been included in our projects. But in feasibility, there is, someone from the BET, as an example. Bill Drake was on New Lebanon's committee, and I don't think that it necessarily included the same people when it moved to the building committee. But I think there were still, transitioning 2 or 3 or something, again, I don't remember back to all these details, but it's more of a question to you, whether you would be willing to do this, because I think that would be a very positive step in terms of the kind of things, whether that Nisha has suggested or just moving very quickly towards the overall program.
We will be as inclusive as we can be. I've already spoken even to Tom Healy, who's the principal, about hosting like a charrette, visioning sort of like community meeting on a Saturday morning, just doing having as many opportunities as we can. And I think, from Dan's perspective as well, if we can get the building committee together, once the EdSpec actually is approved, the building committee could actually even do that work in, May and June, before we actually really start the work in July. So it's not like we even have to spend that money in the next 6 weeks, if that makes sense, for the testing aspect. The EdSpec is more about the spaces, what needs to go inside the building. I mean, what is it that we are constructing, if that makes sense? So we're going to be as inclusive as possible. We know that this is a huge project for the community, and there'll be a lot of community interest.
Okay, so, Laura?
I just wanted to make a comment on accelerating the construction. I think that we have a solid plan in place to do the necessary interim repairs, and I think we don't do ourselves any favors by being too aggressive. I think at the end of the day, we need to focus on an outcome, which is a middle school that the community is proud of, that will meet our needs for years and years to come. And, I think, there's a couple of assumptions that have been made here. My recollection with a couple of the building projects that I've been involved is the state was very interested in the design because it played right into the cost estimates, et cetera. So, I don't know if we can make that assumption, but we can sure find out, right? Somebody could place a call, either utilizing the state delegation or asking somebody at DAS or the architects that we've been using. So we can find that out very easily and then make a decision. But at the end of the day, I think we really need to focus on the outcome And that's what we should, I mean, our process is cumbersome, there's no doubt about it. But it also is useful. It's, that old saying, you fail to plan, plan to fail. So I think we really need to be mindful of how we, be as aggressive as possible, but not at the expense of a quality middle school. And if there's no more questions, I'm happy to make the motion.
Can I just ask a couple more questions myself?
Of course.
Yeah, so, you talked about a consultant for the ed specs, and I think Dan also talked about, hiring the engineers for the various and sundry testing. The consultant for the ed specs, do you plan to do, an RFP for that?
I'm in discussions with Eugene about that right now, whether or not we do a consultant contract that is less than 15 or just below, or do we need to go out? And so because it is just the ed spec, it's very different than what we normally go through with feasibility.
Okay. And can I ask Kathleen, do you have any comment on that particular question? Kathleen?
Specifically, sorry.
The question is, the ed specs, whether you think you should go out, whether the Board of Education should go outside to do an RFP for a consultant for the ed specs.
I don't really have any particular perspective on that level of detail.
Okay, and then I think, Dan, you indicated that you probably would do an RFP for the engineer, is that correct? Engineering for the, or whatever, for the testing, the environmental testing, the weight-bearing testing, whatever kind of testing you would, engineering type of testing. Right. Can you share, or do you remember who did the field testing for you? And was that field testing done for the Parks and Rec, or was it done by the Board of Education? Done by the Board.
It was done,
Or whatever.
Dan didn't have his mic on, so we've corrected that.
the testing was done by the Board of Education for the fields.
You can get back to us.
Yeah, it
You can get back to
escapes
us.
me. They're working right now with, the same engineering firm is working right now with DPW on the soils project at the high school. I just can't think of the name of the company.
AECom?
No, it was they were a field engineer, they were specialized in fields. I just can't think of the name.
Okay.
Leslie, can I make a really quick
Yeah,
point?
yeah.
I just want to comment on what Laura's saying. I don't, I don't believe this is what I've proposed is something that's aggressive. I think we owe it to our community to do, I think actually what I'm proposing is common sense, to do a project in 2.5 to 3 years versus 5 years. I do not think by any means that it's aggressive. I think we owe it to our community, and I think it's important to be consistent, right? We have, on one side, we have messages and emails to our parents' community that the school is structurally unsound, and, we're going to do everything we can to keep it in place in emergency. And then on the other side, we're proposing 5-year plans, and then when someone suggests 3 years, we're like, well, oh my God, that's too aggressive. It is not aggressive. It is something that involves thinking about our process a little bit differently. I think it's also people on this board and other boards looking at it in a different manner, but it's also respecting the constraints that exist with public projects. So I don't believe this is aggressive. I think we need to look at it and we can study it in a different way. But by no means is this something that I believe is not doable. And whether we get it done by June or we look at a different process, I think there are ways to get this done a little bit faster, and I hope we're all open to considering that.
So
And I'm happy to make a motion if, Leslie, you need it.
No, I would like to just ask another question, please. So I want to ask Tony or Sean, if we were to split this 150 into 2 sub-accounts, how much would you want for A&E and how much would you want for, remember, you've heard what Roland has said. I mean, is the 15 adequate for the ed specs? And then 135 for the engineering as a best indicator at this point in time?
As long as Sean has the flexibility to move it, the 15 is fine, to split it that way. But the Board of Ed was just clear after their Finance Committee meeting, and then at the meeting the other night, that they didn't want to just lock us into that box, just in case.
So this would be approved as $150,000. And, but Roland would prepare the sub-accounts and Sean can track it. So do we have any more questions?
Well, I'm just wondering what the purpose of splitting it up is, if essentially it's all one bucket.
Well,
I'm trying to get the point.
It does get to a little bit more visible in terms of tracking if we want to. And then, and then the building committee will be coming on anyway, and they'll have, I mean, remember, once this building committee is formed and becomes active, then these accounts go under the jurisdiction of the building committee, right? I mean, Dan's worked on these school projects before, and I think it's a tracking thing. It's nothing more. It creates a little bit of visibility, but, again, Roland has told us that the money can, you empty one and you can use it the other, and that's available to the BOE until, and it's my understanding, until the building committee is formed, and then this becomes part of their total capital, but obviously they need substantially more than that.
Okay, I don't understand it, but as long as it doesn't hamper their flexibility, I will support that.
Okay, good. So do we have any more questions, or do we want to move the $150,000 for the additional appropriation to prepare ed specs and then do the environmental analysis?
So moved.
Nisha moves this. Is there a second? Laura has seconded this. So once again, I will take a vote. Nisha?
Yes.
Laura?
Yes.
Leslie?
Yes.
And I am also a yes, so that's 4-0-0. So do I have a motion to adjourn this meeting?
So moved.
Nisha moved.
Second.
Leslie seconded. And it is 10:59. Those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
So we've adjourned this meeting now at 10:59 a.m., and I thank all involved. So